Heavenly Father, today we put on the full armor to protect us against attack. We put on the belt of truth to protect against lies and deception. We put on the breastplate of righteousness to protect our hearts from the temptations. We put the gospel of peace on our feet to walk in your light, peace, and freedom with the Holy Spirit. We rebuke anxious thoughts. We take up your shield of faith for protection to block and destroy all the darts and threats thrown at us by the enemy. We put on the helmet of salvation to cover our minds and thoughts, reminding us that we are children of a mighty King. We are forgiven, set free, saved by the blood of Jesus. We take up the sword of the Spirit, your living word, that has the power to demolish strongholds and is sharper than any double-edged sword. We come to you, Lord, in prayer daily. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
What's up, you guys? Welcome to The Imagination. I'm your host, Emma, and today I'm honored to have back on the show for the third time human trafficking, satanic ritual abuse, and Jesuit mind control survivor and whistleblower, writer and author, educator, blogger, and one of my most requested podcast guests, Svali. A short overview in case you're new here or in case you missed our previous two episodes. Svali has been a voice for survivors for years now through her blogs, Svali Speaks and Svali Speaks Again, and her books she has authored, including Breaking Free of Cult Programming and It's Not Impossible, which have laid the foundations for what we know today about cults, trauma-based mind control, deprogramming, secret societies, including the Jesuit order, the history of the Illuminati, and so much more. Born and raised in a cult group and having experienced horrors beyond comprehension, Svali broke free of her cult group several years ago and has been on a quest to share the knowledge that she has learned from personal experience to help set other captives free. There are years of eye-opening information on her blogs, and her books give a very concise and no-nonsense look at the underworld of mind control and the underlying mechanisms to which it is orchestrated, used generationally, and hidden from society. On Svali's first episode on the podcast, we did a deep dive into mind control and secret societies. The last episode we did together, we dove even deeper into the underlying mechanisms of programming, introduced internal systems, and how to overcome emotions. And on today's episode, Svali is going to be sharing her own miraculous testimony. Svali has devoted years of her life and endless hours of her time sharing information to help assist survivors and therapists alike on how to heal from cult programming. There have been a number of survivors on this podcast alone who have referenced Svali's work as being instrumental in their own healing journey, and many of you listening have also expressed your gratitude in the comment section to Svali for all the ways she's helped you further your own understanding of these occult networks and their programming methods. After all that Svali has done to help others become the victors and overcomers of their own testimony, I asked her if she'd be willing to share her testimony, as I'm sure those of you who have been loyal in following her journey throughout the years would love to learn more about the person who has helped you along your journey. I was honored when she said yes. So today we have the honor of hearing Svali speak about her own testimony and the miraculous ways her walk with God has breathed healing and protection into her life. And I ask all of you today to please pray protection over Svali, to please pray protection over everything in Svali's life, including pets, family, all the work that she's doing as she speaks her testimony and as she speaks and continues her own work, exposing these networks and these programming methods. Before I finish introducing today's guest, I wanted to give just a quick reminder that if you are a survivor or whistleblower who wants to share your story on the podcast, or who wants to share any information privately with me, you can email me at imagineabetterworld2020@gmail.com. I'd also love your support on Substack, where I'm taking up journaling as an outlet for me personally to reflect on the podcast, guests, and my advocacy work. And you can subscribe to me there at www.emmacatherine.substack.com. All of my other social media links are in the show notes, and I want you all to know how eternally grateful I am for the love, empathy, and compassion you show to each brave guest on the show. So you guys, without further ado, please help me in welcoming today's guest of honor, voice for the voiceless, woman of God, overcomer, walking miracle, and someone who continues to help so many break free from cult programming by showing them exactly what is possible. The one, the only, Svali. Svali, thank you so much for being here with me today.
Oh, Emma, thank you for having me. I
It's an
appreciate it.
honor. Absolutely. I know that today's topic is going to be maybe a little bit harder and heavier than some other interviews that you've done or just the material that you've covered. So I just want to reiterate for people listening to please pray over this podcast, whether you're listening as it premieres or after. Please pray over Svali, her family. Please pray over everything in her life and for her protection as she speaks out. This is a little bit of a heavier topic, and we want to make sure that you listening are protected and that every guest that comes on the show has your overwhelming protection through prayer. So prayer warriors, please say prayers for Svali. Please lift her up and please pray protection over her in this podcast. So Svali, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you lead. I'll let you start wherever you want, and we will go through and just talk about your life for once.
Okay. Emma, thank you. And yes, while I often talk about programming, sometimes it's harder to talk personally, my own story. And so thank you for your prayers. They're so appreciated. All right.
Absolutely.
I was conceived in a genetics lab in Switzerland. That's where the Jesuits have their genetics laboratories, in a petri dish, and was implanted in a birth mother. And the Jesuit order does not follow so much a bloodline as wanting a mix of different bloodlines, different generational iniquities for their children or their babies. So they want various abilities. And so that's what but I was also generation 3, meaning I was the third generation of genetic knowledge in our order, because we had every time genetics knowledge was enhanced and we got new information, because they've been working on it since World War II or before, basically. Generation 1 started about 1945. Generation 2 was in the early 50s. I was generation 3. I was born on January 5th, 1957. My children were generation 12, 13, and 14. And they're now up to generation, well, I'm assuming when I left several years ago, they were into the 20s. So when I say generation, I mean for enhanced intelligence, enhanced strength, enhanced healing ability, the different factors that they were looking for in the genetics. Because while the human genome supposedly was discovered several decades ago, the occultic groups had that knowledge many, many, many years before, and have been able to actively select various characteristics such as eye color, hair color, for many decades. Anyway, I was raised in a facility in Rome that's a bit to the north of Italy for the first 3 years of my life. That was my world. It was a highly funded facility with lots of programming labs and studios, so they could do a lot of setups. And during these 3 years, one of our primary programmers was Joseph Mengele, and Hildy, his assistant. She was a blonde, blue-eyed individual who was probably, I believe, possibly the only individual that Mengele ever loved in his life. I'm not going to go into my Mengele memories here, though, so much. I also had the 12 Jesuit fathers I love. These were also my primary trainers, because in the Jesuit order, they didn't just bond you to one person, because they know that if that person went out on a mission, became ill or sick, then they're going to have a child that's very difficult to work with. So they bonded me and the other infants to 12 fathers. And then I had 3 primary fathers I loved the most: Father Matteo, Father Jerome, and Father Carlotti. And they were my main programmers during the first 3 years. They developed presentations and did subs in the programming labs for my various presentations, who were first hosted out in various countries when I was 3 years old. A presentation, meaning if I was in France, my name was Jean, and Jean spoke French. She lived in France and had a French family, mother, father, brothers, sisters. When I was in Russia, I was Katerina or Katya, and I had a I had my children were twins there, and I had a family there. So these are called presentations. My Russian presentation, my French presentation, my German presentation. I was Anna in Germany, and so on. So these presentations would be hosted for several weeks each year in each country. But I was part of a triplet set because the Jesuits raise babies as triplets and not as twins. And so my two triplets would also rotate in the presentations as well, so that they could switch me out with a twin, and my twin would take over then for a while. And then they would switch me out with, and then another twin would switch out. So we didn't have to be in the countries continuously. But also in my Illuminati cover, which was about four of my presentations, the Illuminati know that children rotate between presentations. So we didn't have to have a child in America, a child in Germany, a child in France, and a child in Russia, because those were all Illuminati. It said the three of us could rotate and take turns. But anyway, but my real home was the facility in Italy. And in fact, we sometimes called it Jerusalem because the Jesuits use a lot of biblical terms. And so Jerusalem was home, and that was the facility. Growing up, I had a lot of traumas, which you can guess from my programming articles and interviews. And by the time I was 13, I was a full father, because in the Jesuit order, you go through your coming of age ceremony when you're 13. But I also was increasingly unhappy there. And so when I was in my American presentation I was 13, almost 14, I ran away. And I was actually gone for a month and a half. I lived on the streets. I went to I was first in Florida, and then I went up to New York City. I I stayed at a shelter, and then I ended up living with an older boyfriend who, like me, had troubles at home. And that was my first taste of life away from the order, the regimen, the discipline of my childhood training. And for the first time, I think I got a good glimpse of the fact that not everyone is an occultist, because growing up, that's what I was surrounded by. So I thought everybody was in the cult and was taught that. So during that 6 weeks, I actually living on the streets of New York City was so much easier than going through what I did in the facility in some ways. But I went to a rock concert. I was doing drugs. I overdosed. I was taken to the ER. My stomach was pumped. And while I was semi-conscious, I happened to tell them my name. And my parents had an APB out for me. This is years before this was common. They had an all points bulletin out, flew up, got me. And when they came, when my American parents came, I was screaming, "Don't make me go back. I'll get hurt. I'll get hurt." And my American mother said, "Oh, that's just the drugs talking. You know, we love her, and she's just hallucinating that we would ever hurt her." So the nurses sedated me, and I was taken back on the plane back home. By the way, these are all conscious American presentation memories. This was not dissociated. So my American mother didn't know what to do with me at that point, because I was hosting there for a little bit longer, because they wanted to assess if the drugs had impacted me and other experiences. But so for some reason that I believe is a God thing, she took me to a Christian meeting. I was 14 years old at the time, and I heard the gospel for the first time. And one of my friends from school in America went forward to receive Christ and came back crying. And I remember saying, "Why are you crying?" And she said, "Because I'm so happy." And I'm like, "Huh?" I thought, well, I want to see what this is. So I went forward, and the person, and I said, "Well, I want to do this too. I want to say the prayer." And I started to say it, and all of a sudden I got up and I literally ran out of that church. I could, I couldn't stay there. I, but then what happened is that night, though, I went to bed and I had the most awful nightmare ever. I dreamed that there was an apocalypse, and I was slogging through bloody bodies. And I mean, it was horrible. And so I woke up just in a terrible state. And I was starting to have some flashbacks too of what I now know were some of my trauma memories, but I thought I was losing my mind. And so I begged my mother to take me back to pray with the leader of the prayer ministry. It was a charismatic movement in the Episcopal Church, and she did. And when we met with him, I said, I'm just having these horrible dreams. I haven't slept in 2 days. I mean, I was ready to break down. I said, help me. And he said, have you ever been involved in the cult? I said, well, not really, because at that point I was totally amnesic in my American presentation. I said, but I did play with a Ouija board once with my cousins, and I told them about that. And I said, and we tried doing ghost games. And so I had to renounce any involvement in the cult. He then led me through the sinner's prayer, and it was like a light bulb was turned on inside. It's like I hadn't even known how dark I was inside, but it's like a light came on inside. And for the first time in my entire life, I knew I was loved. I had never, even though I was loved, quote unquote, by the fathers, and they really did to the degree that they could, it was always a controlled, chained love. It was a love of a slave to fear, trying to love another person. But this was real, real life-changing love. And so I became a real Christian. And for the next 3 months, this is another miracle. I stayed in America. They tried to get me to go to the facility, and I said no. And for some reason, they were not allowed to pull me back. So for those 3 months, it was like a continuous walk of God's love, His grace, His mercy. I was reading the Bible. I spoke in tongues, and I believe it was real because I did on my own. I didn't have anyone else lay hands on me because I didn't know anything about that. But the main thing is, I felt like Jesus was walking next to me, showing His love to me, and so many parts of me became Christians at that time. And now I experienced intense anger from my American family. They made fun of me. They called me a Jesus freak. They said this would pass. They said give it up. It's they did everything they could to persecute me but it didn't work. And years later, I asked my mother, why did you take me to that meeting if you're not a Christian yourself? Because I found it later. She said, because I didn't know what to do with you. I was hoping that maybe they could help me control you. But it backfired, as you can tell. So it was an amazing experience for 3 months of pure love. But then at the end of 3 months, three of the fathers I loved, my twins, they brought in I was raised with 12 other children in my class because they do classes. I was in the first class in the facility. They had class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4 in the facility, and each class was of 12. And my 12 classmates that I've been raised with who we called each other brother and sister. I was closer to them than a brother or a sister, all came. And they said, you have to come back with us to Rome or else we will die without knowing Jesus. If you want us to hear about your God, you have to come back to Rome. And that's how they got me to go back. Because I knew that the fathers would kill some of them to punish me. And so, I don't know, I cannot explain why they needed my agreement, but they did. But I suspect part of it is you're less programmable if you don't agree. But there had to be an element of my agreement. So I said, okay, I'll go back because I wanted to witness. And as soon as I said that, though, I felt the Holy Spirit inside me say, no. It was like Jesus internally was saying, no, I don't want you to go. And I argued with them. I said, but they don't know you. I want to be a witness. Don't go. I said, but I want them to know you so badly. They'll die and go to hell if I don't. And he said again, don't go. And I was crying then. I said, Lord, I have to. I love them too much. So I went back to Rome, and that started a 3-month period of intense and horrific reprogramming. And I won't go into the details there. That would be a whole thing. But it involved seeing lots of people tortured in front of me and them saying, why isn't God answering your prayers for these people? It involved watching people I loved being killed. They killed half my class. in front of me. And they said, unless you recant, they will all die. So finally I recanted after several weeks of this. And me being tortured, them being tortured, and them saying, well, if God loves you so much, why is he allowing this? And things like that. I recanted my faith in Christ. And then in my American presentation and my cult host, felt completely broken. I was never the same again. The love, the peace, the joy was gone. And I felt as though I was just a shell of a human being after that. But then they did the extensive reprogramming so that I could go on and do the jobs that I had been doing so very well. By then, I was a full trainer. I was a second trainer under the person who ran our facility, our main facility. They wanted me to carry Satan's child, and that's a whole other thing I won't go into in this testimony, except that I tried and I aborted the fetus when it was several months old. If I would have died otherwise, I believe. And there's all kinds of things that will probably stretch believability. Okay, so I continued with my cult jobs. I was reinstated. I even became an oracle for a year for the Rothschild family in France. And that was an easy job since in the Jesuit order, I mean, you have to do all kinds of stuff like that since you're very tiny. I eventually took over the main facility as the head programmer over it when I was in my 20s. I became a part of the Vatican 33, which are their top assassins. And I became captain when I was 30. I helped to oversee the training council. There are 12 members who discuss training and strategy and planning. And then and I also helped to oversee the Vatican School when I was in my 30s. But all this time, I was very depressed in my American presentation. I realized that something was terribly wrong, but I didn't know what. I knew that I lost the joy in my faith, but I had no idea why. In my American presentation, I just walked around with this horrible, tremendous sense of guilt, and that I couldn't come to God, and I had no idea why. I eventually, when I was in my 20s, when I was coming over to the U.S. for a mission, for a few weeks. In San Diego, I lived in San Diego and was on the training council for the Illuminati there, because as I mentioned before, the Jesuits were infiltrating the Illuminati to learn what they knew and vice versa. Well, all the groups do that. But at age 23, I went to therapy with a Christian therapist who diagnosed me with endogenous depression, meaning that she couldn't see any reason in what I was telling her for the extreme depression I was battling. Soon after I got married, it was an arranged marriage by the Illuminati here in the U.S. My American husband was a member of the Illuminati. I was on the Western Leadership Council then for the Illuminati for years on their training council. I had 2 children. Now, I also, in my other presentations around the world, I was also getting married and having children. So you could say at that time of my life, I had numerous husbands and numerous different children. So Jean had her own children, her own husband. She had a twin sister. My twin sister from Elizabeth was allowed to be my twin in France. Trixie or Beatrice in the UK got married, had her own children. So because I was hosting these children who would be used to infiltrate the Illuminati in those countries. I also had some presentations in non-Illuminati countries. But anyway, I'm not going to go into all the mechanics of that, but it was complex, but took a lot of scheduling, but it happens. Some of my children in my overseas presentations were biological children, some weren't. But I hosted them and believed that they were my own children. The only presentation that I did not get married in was in Amsterdam. I had a presentation there, and she was bisexual and had a a female lover there. Okay. So I'm married in America, but I'm going back to the facility in Rome for basically 8 months or 9 months a year of my life because my main personality was my cult host. I was Father Luke in the order. Once you become a father, you are given a male name, even though my birth name was Lucian, and I was called Lucia or Luce. As a child, everybody called me Luce in the order. But as Father Luke, I was helping to develop advanced technologies for the group. I was including prototypes of the modern machine technology that's used almost universally nowadays. I also became very, very depressed, even as Father Luke, as I realized the potential for harm to people. Now, then I remember that one day I was living in Ohio. I was in my early 30s. And my husband at the time was out of town for work. I remember it was a windy night and I was just feeling terrified. I remember I just felt like there was this weird presence. So I was praying because remember, I was still Christian, even though I felt cut off from God. I was still praying and going to church. I was just living a powerless Christian life at the time. I was praying for my children and I for protection. And that night, though, I fell asleep and I had a dream. And in the dream, there were three witches chasing me. They had long claws that matted gnarly hair and they were cackling. Now, I remember at this time, I had no knowledge I'd ever been in a cult. I had had no memories. I thought I was just this American Christian mom, with kids. So I had no idea of my real life. But in the dream, the three witches were trying to claw at me with their long nails and they had teeth, with blood dripping and all that. And they were going, yeah, and staring. And I'm running and I'm running and I'm running for my life because I know that they want to kill me and destroy me. And suddenly up ahead, I see this wooden shed. So I run into the shed. I shut the door and I barricade it. I can hear them scratching outside of the shed. I'm just terrified. And suddenly I turn around and in the shed, in the corner, there's Jesus standing. And he's looking at me with such love and such peace and such power and authority that I'm not afraid. I can hear the scratching outside, but in his presence, there was no fear. It was like he surrounded me with protection and love. And as I'm looking at him, and he's looking at me with eyes of love, he then points to a chest, and I see that there's this carved chest near him. And he says to me, I want you to open it up. And I open it up. And inside the chest, to my great surprise, I see a figurine of me. It looks just like me, except that it's carved in white, a white stone, almost like alabaster, but much harder. But it's this white stone figure of me that looks exactly like me. And I look at it and I look at him and he says, I want you to pick it up and smash it. I go, okay. And I put my hands under that figurine, which is, maybe about 3 feet long and maybe a foot wide. And I try with all my strength to pick it up and I can't. I try, and it seems like it's hours, in the dream until I'm sweating, almost sweating blood. I'm trying so hard to pick up the figurine and pick it up and smash it, and I can't. So in despair, I turn to him and I say, Lord, I want to, but I can't. And then he says, let me help you. And in the dream, he puts his arms underneath mine, his hands underneath mine, and together we lift the figurine and smash it on the floor. And it smashes into dust and just like evaporates. And I turn to thank him, and he's gone. And so then I it's quiet. So I go outside of the shed, I unlock it, I go outside, and suddenly the three witches are back, you know, trying to claw and get at me. And in the dream, I look at them and I laugh. I'm not afraid of them. I realize they can't hurt me. I'm laughing at them. I realize I'm free. And then I wake up. Now, remember, I have no idea that I have a cult background. So when I had the dream, I remember thinking, but I felt so peaceful afterwards and so happy. I remember thinking, ah, what does that dream mean? I know it has to mean something, but I have no idea. And at the time, I was about 31. And so now I realize, of course, that I believe that Jesus was showing me that he would help me to break my programming, that uh, stone statue of me represented my programming, the programmed me, the false me. Okay, well,
So powerful. I always say that, I meet God over and over and over again through listening to testimonies, and it's just amazing how personalized his healing path is for each person that needs it. He shows
yeah,
up in exactly the way that you need and exactly the way that somebody else needs, and it's never the same way. It's so personal to the person. That dream's
yeah,
incredible.
yeah. So even then, God was he was reaching out to me, and that helped. Meanwhile, I go back to Rome. I'm doing occultic ceremonies. I'm doing rituals. Even though in my American presentation I'm quote unquote Christian, but remember a powerless Christian still, even after that dream. And so it's not like the dream healed me, but I think Jesus was showing me what he was going to be doing one day for me. Um, then in America, my husband goes for deliverance ministry because he was a quote unquote Christian too and felt that he needed deliverance. And as soon as he said that, I said, well, I should go for deliverance too. I think I could use it. He goes, oh, no, 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 you're fine. Don't do it. And I said, well, I think I need it. No, don't. And I said, I am. So I'm one of those stubborn people. You tell me not to do something, I will go and do it. So I go the next day to the local to a large well-known church. I had a deliverance ministry in San Diego, and I had made an appointment by phone to meet with them. And so they had me fill out this form. It was like an intake questionnaire. And I leave it there at their desk and I go home. And 2 hours later, I get a call and they say, you need to come in tomorrow right away. And I'm like, okay, what's the rush? And they said, do you realize that you checked every single trauma related to occultic abuse? I said, no, I had no memory of doing that. They said, yeah, you mentioned rituals and this and that. And I'm like, seriously? And they said, yes, we'd like you need to come in. I'm like, okay. So I'm thinking maybe I do need a little deliverance. So I go in for deliverance. Um, and the minister says a quick prayer and they says, I want you to do a prayer of renunciation. And so I start to say the words, Jesus, in your name, I renounce all occultic activity in my life. And the words aren't even out of my mouth before suddenly I get up, I crouch in a corner, I start screaming, why are you hurting me if you love me? Why are you telling me you love me and you're hurting me? And this goes on for a while. I'm actually reliving something, but I don't know at the time. And afterwards I'm shaking, I tell him, am I losing my mind? What is this? What the heck is this? And he says, I don't know. But he says, but it's possible you could have some trauma because this is not normal during deliverance. I was thinking, okay, so I'm not normal. Great. So I get a referral to another prayer minister and I decide, you know what, maybe I need therapy. So I start to work with various therapists who work with PTSD and dissociation. And I see one therapist in San Diego who after the first session, I say, I'm wondering if I have some dissociation because these things are starting to come out. I'm starting to spontaneously at home have memories of sexual abuse, and I'm hearing people in my head. I'm seeing flashes of chanting and candles and robes and blah blah blah. And I said, I'm wondering if this could be dissociation. And he goes, oh no 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 no, you're much too functional. You can be working as a nurse and raising. You're much too functional. People with dissociation are complete wrecks. And I'm thinking, oh. Well, and I said, well, something's going on. And he agreed and he said, well, let's work on the PTSD a little bit. So I learned a little bit of grounding, but I wasn't real happy with, because he kept dismissing everything I was trying to tell him, or he tried to get me not to go there. So then I saw another therapist. I saw some really awful therapists. I saw one who was a Christian referral for a large Christian counseling center in San Diego. And when I started to disclose my concern about losing time, she goes, oh, everybody does that. I do. When I get angry, people have to tell me later what I said and did. That's typical. And as I share an abuse memory, she says, oh, that's nothing. She said, we all go through it. And she said, my brother threw me down the steps when I was 4, and then he killed an animal in front of me to make me not tell my parents. So I stopped seeing her because I realized maybe she's not normal.
Oh my gosh.
So there's all kinds of therapists out there. But I finally found a woman who was very good and very supportive. And she was helping me through, to at least process memories without leading me. I was journaling a lot at that time. But what I realized is that the more I journaled, the more I talked to parts, the more anxious and terrified I became. It was like this vicious cycle. I'd work on healing, I'd go into session, I'd talk, and then bam, I would just be completely terrified within a day or two. I didn't know at the time, but I had parts of it go and report what I was remembering, and then I would get, reprogrammed and punished for telling. But I didn't know that at the time. I knew as I was getting worse instead of better, I was decompensating the harder I was trying to heal. Well, then finally, I was seeing a therapist in Los Angeles who specialized in DID, and I was driving an hour to go see him once every 2 weeks. And finally, I told him, I said, I need to go inpatient for my safety, because I want to be in a safe place where I can look at this stuff and not suicide. Because I realized that and I looked at him, I said, is it normal to have dreams about being shocked with electric shock? He said, no, I've never heard that before. I was like, well, I need to be inpatient because I have a lot of stuff going on inside and I need to have the safety of that. So he said, I've only referred one other person inpatient in my entire career, which was 20 years of working with trauma and dissociation. But he said, I will refer you to a place in Texas. And he referred me to a place that specialized in working with dissociation in Texas. So I went there. I was supposed to go for 2 weeks. Only while I was on that unit, my first day there, one of the therapists said, I wanted to talk to blah, blah, blah. And the second day there, I'm sorry, she wanted to get into my system and talk to parts. And I told her, no, you can't do that. I have violent protectors who will hurt you if you try to do that. She goes, well, I want to talk to them anyway. I said, no, do you understand? They will come out and attack you if you keep pushing. And I said, I cannot let you into my system because these violent protectors will try to hurt you. She goes, well, do it anyway. Let me in anyway. Bring this person out. So I took a pencil and stabbed her. I didn't kill her, but I hurt her. And this created a huge uproar on the unit, and they had to do an incident report. And then the director of the unit and the psychiatrist of the unit came and talked to me. And they sat me down and they said, why did you do it? And I told her what happened. And I had heard her at the nurse's desk saying, well, I pushed her too hard and she must have had a psychotic snap. Well, I told them how the conversation had gone, and she validated that I was telling the truth. And then the psychiatrist there said, you are still in the cult. Now, at that point, I remember being abused for the first 3 years of my life in a cult group by my father, whom my mother divorced when I was 3. So I thought I was just dealing with ages 0 to 3 of cult abuse. I said, no, that can't be. They said, and he said, no, this stuff is too fresh. You would not respond that way. I look at him and then I start shaking and shaking and shaking. And I go, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And then I said, the memories start pouring. I said, yeah, I remember. I remember. Oh my God. Oh, you're right. And I said, my husband's name is Baltazar. My name is Anna and the Colton. And oh my God. And my children are in it too. And we're on, and I was just freaking. And fortunately, they had medication to calm me down. And I start journaling and and they put me in an isolation room because they will make sure I wasn't going to be violent again or anything. But as long as you didn't like not listen to me, I wasn't violent. If and so after a while, the shaking stops, and but the flood of memories, it was like boom, 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 boom. All my parts start cheering about being involved in the cult in San Diego. And it was like watching a video reel. And it was like, oh my gosh. So I call my husband in San Diego and I tell him, I'm remembering that you and I are active in a satanic cult. And I told him his cult name. I told him mine. And I said, I cannot go back because if I do, I will be hurt badly. And he's like, well, I don't remember that. I said, well, I know, but I said, it's true. I said, I'm not making this stuff up. Well, I don't know. I don't remember that. And I said, I know, but it's true. And then I said, I would like you to consider coming out here and meeting with a therapist because I can't go back into that situation unless you're willing to come and talk to the therapist here. Well, I ended up being inpatient for a month. And at the end of and so my husband assured me that he would come and meet with the therapist when I was outpatient. So then I go outpatient because I decide I ain't going back to San Diego. And I'm living in a cheap apartment, and with another gal from the unit who had been discharged with me. And I'm having the flood of memories, and I'm working in outpatient therapy at that time in groups and stuff. And my husband has agreed to come in 2 days. So on the day that he's supposed to show up, he doesn't show up. I had an appointment arranged with the therapist. So I go home and I call him and I say, why aren't you here? And he says, it's not safe there. I said, what? I'm saying exactly how he said to me, the tone, it's not safe there. I said, what do you mean it's not safe? It's perfectly safe. These are good. No one's going to hurt you. He said, those therapists aren't safe. In that a monotone voice, I thought, holy crap, they've gotten a hold of him. And I said, that's not true. I said, please, I want to work things out. Please come and get some therapy. No, I can't. And he hangs up. I'm horrified. Well, I'm making plans then to see if I can find someone to go with me to San Diego because I won't go alone. But then what happens is the next day I'm at the apartment and there's a knock at the door. And it's a policeman, and he serves me with a divorce order, divorce papers, and a restraining order saying that I cannot come within 1,000 feet of my children because I'm considered an abduction risk. Well, that day I go to the bank to take, I had about $10,000 in savings I'd saved as a nurse. So I go to my bank then to get some money because I'm going to try to figure out a way to hire a bodyguard to go with me to San Diego. And my bank accounts are all empty. And I go to the bank teller, I said, what happened to all my money? And she said, well, you had a joint account, didn't you? I said, yes. And she said, well, your husband emptied all your accounts out. I said, he can't, that's illegal. And she said, no, if you have a joint account, he can. So I was penniless. A divorce decree, a restraining order, and a husband who is not very happy. So he ends up divorcing me. I ended up trying to fly to San Diego or driving to San Diego with a friend, and I want to abduct my children, but then my sister, who I visited and who was also programmed, said, if you do that, you will go to jail. You will not pass go. You will be in jail if you take those children out of state. You do know that, don't you? So it was 4 years until I got custody of my children. And what happened was I had finally reopened the custody case with a paralegal, which was all I could afford, because my first lawyer didn't represent me at all. She was horrible. And I realize now she was a cult lawyer because she told me, oh, don't go to the custody hearings. That's not important. I'll take care of it. And things like that. I did go, but I realize now that, she was not on my side. But the paralegal was, and when she saw the divorce decree, she said, this is the most horrifically awful divorce decree I've ever seen in my life. I said, I know. And so she and I both reopened the custody case, and I was allowed to have supervised visitation, and then finally an unsupervised visit by both of my children. But this is 4 years later. So my daughter, who was 14, is already an adult and a father in the order. My son is 10, and there's a lot of issues. So they come out to visit me, and during the visit, they disclose that they are being abused. So I go to a CPS worker and I tell her about, and she interviews the children separately. And then she comes in, she says, you're just leading them on because these things don't happen. So you're trying to get custody of children. So you've coached them to lie. Alec, dude. So my husband then flies out to get the children because I don't want to let them fly back and go through that. I can't. And I'm thinking, even if it's jail, I may have to. He comes out and he goes to church with me that day. And then afterwards, he's talking to me and he says, you have to give the children back. I said, I can't. They're telling me they're being hurt, and I believe them. And he goes, well, I don't remember anything like that. I said, well, why don't you pray and ask God if what I'm saying is true? He says, okay. So he kneels there. Now, by the way, by this time, of course, he's divorced me and I've remarried, and that's another story. But anyway, he kneels down. He says, Jesus, if there's something to this, if there's anything true about what she's saying, show me. He starts shaking. And he goes, oh my. I said, what is it? He said, I'm having memories of being in a ritual. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. And he's like freaking. He's acting like he's having a nervous breakdown. And he says, oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. I said, I know. And I said, it's okay. And I said, I'm here. You're safe. I start grounding him with the techniques I've been learning in therapy. He says, it's true, isn't it? It's true. I said, yes. So he goes and he actually types up a paper that assigns me custody of our children. And he meets with someone who can annotate, who can notate it, a notary, and then I then get full custody of the children. He flies back to San Diego and then moves to Texas to be in therapy for his dissociation and cult abuse. But what I didn't realize at the time, I thought it was a miracle of God, but I didn't realize at the time was that actually my children were there to access me, as well as my current husband. That they remember, my daughter's an adult. She's already a trainer in the Jesuit order, and I was allowed to have custody to draw me further back and to make me less restless. I'm going over a lot really fast. Now, I shared some of this in my blog, up to getting custody of my children. So, long story short, then I've been writing my blog for a couple of years until I got custody of my children. Now, my second husband was a survivor that I met in a therapy group who was supposedly healing and getting better and working through his dissociation. But I came to realize years later that he was, he was my handler too at the time, one of my handlers. So what happened then is, so I was reaccessed. I went through all the reprogramming, and during this time, I was working in America as a writer. I was doing my jobs overseas. I was, doing a lot of the stuff that I was consulting with other trainers. But I was feeling increasing despair because I realized I felt as if my soul was slowly dying inside. And then I was going to a church, and I shared with the pastor some of the struggles I was going through. I actually disclosed I was a ritual abuse survivor and that I was struggling with feeling suicidal. And the next day he calls me, he says, I want you to leave our church. We can't handle someone like you.
Awful. That happens so much in churches.
Yeah. And
And
so
therapeutic clinics.
yeah,
That's horrible.
I went that night. I cried and cried and cried and cried. I said, God, if this is how your church feels about me, if this is how you feel about me, I will never go to church again as long as I live. If this is how your people are going to treat me, I can't take it. And that night I had another dream. And in the dream, I'm in this large room. And it's like an anteroom or a waiting room. I see that there's millions of people, it seems, in the room, and they're all kind of like sitting along the wall, lined up. And then I see that there's two doors. And as I watch, there's an angel who comes out of one door, and there's a bright light behind it. And he's carrying a rose, a beautiful rose. And he takes the rose and he walks over to someone and gives it to them. And that individual takes the rose and walks with the angel out through the door with joy. And I realize that person's going to heaven. I don't know how I know it in the dream. I know it. And this happens a few times. And then the other door opens and it's dark. And an angel comes out and they take a person sorrowfully by the hand and take them through the other door. And somehow I realize that person is going to hell. And I can see the sorrow and the reluctance in the angel's face, and the person is just terrified as they're going towards the door. And I can hear, the screams and stuff through that door. And one by one, all the dream sequence is going for hours. But of course, it wasn't in real time. It was probably just, a period of time. One by one, the angel comes out and gives either a rose or nothing, a rose or nothing. And I see all the people going through one door or the other, and I'm sweating right now. I'm sweating buckets because you have to realize, I've been doing some pretty bad stuff for the cult for years. I think, oh man, I'm so screwed. That's what I'm thinking in the dream, because there's no way I'll get a rose. And I'm getting more and more terrified. Finally, the room is emptying out, and I'm the last person in the room. And the angel's going towards me, like, But suddenly Jesus shows up in the room and he says, come with me. I'm like, okay. And he turns around and there's a third door. And we go through that third door. As we go through, it's almost like we're on this high mountain path, with a drop off on both sides. And he's taking me along that path. As we go down, then we go I see a cottage, a stone cottage. And as we open the door, I realize to my surprise, it's a florist's shop. It's just filled with flowers. And Jesus goes to the back. And when he comes back, he brings me a bouquet of the most beautiful roses. They're multicolored. And he puts them in my arms and he says, this is for you. And I wake up.
Oh my gosh. I have chills going down my body right now.
I know. And I felt such joy and such peace and such love. So when I wake up, I say, okay, Lord, I'll try church once again, but this is your last chance. So I go to a church I'd gone to years before, and I'd had a friend I'd been in Bible study with who is not dissociative, and I'd shared with her once a little bit about my background. And so I go to this church and she sees me. I go the following Sunday and she says, are you okay? And I said, well, not really. Why do you ask? And she says, because you look awful. And so she and I go into a back room and we're talking, and she says, you didn't even recognize me when you saw me. Something's going on. what's going on? And I break down and I'm sobbing and I'm telling her how my second husband is tying me down at night and suffocating me every time I share a memory that's coming up to punish me. I tell her how I think he's going to kill me if it continues. I'm telling her I don't know what to do. And she says, "Do you want to come and stay with me?" I'm like, "Yes." And so she says, "Pack your stuff up." So I go and stay with her. But she says, "No cell phone, no computer, no technology, because you will try to contact." And she has a good friend of hers that's a fully healed survivor who says, "Yes, they will try to contact you if you do this. You're not." And I'm terrified because I'm used to being on my phone. I'm used to being on my computer, and all these things. And I'm like, I'm thinking, well, if you guys aren't safe, I'm totally screwed. But I obey the rules. But what happens is I end up, my ex is calling constantly, my second husband, I mean, and I'm not with him. He keeps trying to set up a date. He says, "Let's talk about things. Let's talk about things." And so finally he's calling their phone. So finally I agree to meet with him, and I meet with him for half a day. And when I come back, my friend says, "You can't stay here," because she says, "You lied to me. You said you wouldn't meet with him. You know that he's not safe. Why did you do it?" And I said, "Because he sounded desperate, so he wants to change." And she said, "Well, you're out." Well, I didn't want to go back to my husband, so I went to a women's shelter. And I stayed there for a few weeks. But after 2 days, they sent someone in that I know from my past, who, of course, is signaling to me and passing on messages. So finally, I call and tell me that my husband, who I still love deeply, even though he's been abusive, is going to be killed if I don't call him. So I call him, we meet, I go back with him again for a period of time. This is around 2007. Um, I go back into a shelter. Um, and then he convinces me to go work for a dentist as an office receptionist. And I do. And of course, he's doing construction work for the guy. And I'm sleeping there, but I'm not feeling good. I start outpatient therapy. I decide to go inpatient. And my partner saying, "He's hurting you. This is not safe. This is not good. You're surrounded." And so I contact my friend from the Bible study who kicked me out of her house. And I said, "This is like almost a year later, going back and forth between shelters, staying with my husband, leaving and going back." And I finally say, "I really need to get away from him. Help." So she says, "Well, let's go out of state." So I know of a large Christian church in California, Northern California, and she and I fly there. And I have made arrangements to work as a technical writer, because I was a writer then, for a large firm that did GIS technologies and software. And I'm going to the church, and I was originally supposed to be with this gal, but as soon as my friend, who's not dissociative, finds out that this gal has several boyfriends and is possibly sleeping with them, she goes, "You can't stay here. This is not nice." So we're at church talking about where will I live while I work. And suddenly the gal comes and sits next to me. She says, "I couldn't help but overhear you talking. I'm in a school of ministry at this church. I'm a student. I would love to have you be my roommate." And she seems so nice. And so my friend says, "Oh, this is God, an answer from God." I'm not so sure, but I say, "Okay, well, let's meet." And so we meet the next day. I finally say, "Okay, I'll be your roommate, but I'd like a few days just to prepare for this." And she says, "Okay," because my friend and I are staying at a hotel. And so over the next few days, though, as I meet with her, I'm getting more and more worried. I'm seeing red flags. She's talking about the fact that her husband had committed suicide. She's talking about being traumatized as a child and blah, blah, blah. And then the second roommate shows up, and I recognize her immediately. And so I tell my friend, "These people are a cult, and they want me to live with them because they want to access me." And my friend says, "No, no, no, no. You just want to be dependent on me. And so you're trying to make up an excuse to go back to Texas with me." And I say, "No, no, no, no. These are not nice people." And she goes, "No, you're just being borderline and dependent. I said, but I recognize this one gal. She goes, no, she probably resembles someone you know. So she leaves, and the minute she goes and is on her way back out of state, the two gals turn to me and they say, well, now that your little watchdog is gone, we get to do what we want with you, don't we? And it was horrible. So 2 days later, I'm having panic attacks and I go into a women's shelter to escape them. I'm staying in the women's shelter with nowhere to live. I'm thinking, what do I do? And I'm actually going to work in the daytime. No one at work knows what's going on. And then coming to a women's shelter at night. And I stay there as long as I can, but there's like a limit. And I realize I'm gonna have to find a place to stay. So I go to a Christian therapist at the large ministry who's actually nice. And I say, I need a place to live. And she goes, oh, I have just a place. And it's a gal who is bipolar in the church who's renting your house. So I go stay at the house. Suppose I'm going to have it to myself. But instead, the bipolar gal decides to come on the weekends because she likes me so much. Well, this is a whole situation. So I find out that she's dissociative. Her son, who comes to stay for the first time at this house, is dissociative. And then she decides to rent the house to a gal from a cult group who I recognize immediately. And I go, you're here to take me back to the group, aren't you? And she goes, oh no, you want to access me. And I say, no, I was living here, had never met you, and you come and live here. I know why you're here. And she acts all offended. So I move out, want to go back to the women's shelter, but I can't because you're only allowed one stay. So I call my friend then in Texas and I say, I've got to leave. Can you come and get me? Because at that point, I'm not sure if I can drive. My car isn't that good. Will you come with me and I'll drive back to Texas? So she prays, I'll pray about it. And she prays, comes and gets me, drives me back to Texas. And she says, you can stay here for 1 week, but then you need to find a place to live. So I do. I contact Teen Challenge in a large Texas city. By the way, I'm rambling a lot, aren't I?
No, you're not at all. I was gonna say though, we are coming up on an hour, and
Yeah.
there's still a lot of stuff that you probably wanted to talk about, and we didn't even
Yeah.
get really your walk with God, and sort of how that transpired even more, after all of this. So I wanted to see if you maybe wanted to maybe bookmark here, and then we can do
Yes.
two.
Yes. So this is part one, and I will start sharing more about my journey out and what I went through. These are some of the circumstances that I did go through in trying to break free. A lot of times, one reason I'm sharing this, I have a lot of people say, where do I find safety? You talk about safety. It is not easy, as my story is showing, to find safety. It is not something that you say a quick prayer, God, I want to be safe, and it suddenly shows up at your door. I had made the decision, very horrible, painful decision, to break off with my entire family because I knew they were cult. I knew that they were programmed to try to draw me back. I knew that. And I knew that in order to truly break free, and for my children and grandchildren to one day know that it's possible to get free, I had to break off all contact, or else I would be carted back and reprogrammed. But there were no safe houses. I searched everywhere around I contacted everybody I'd ever known, and there were none. None. Not only that, but I had heard about a couple of safe houses, but they were instantly infiltrated. So that if you went to those, you were guaranteed to have someone try to take you back to the cult. I contacted therapists coast to coast, ministries, nothing. So that's why I went to women's shelters. Even though within a few days, of course, someone I knew would show up, but I mean, I'm telling you, when I made the decision to break up all contact and made the decision internally, I don't want to go back. It was not easy to find any kind of safety or accountability.
And you didn't even have, they robbed you of your money, they took away your
Yeah,
resources, and
yeah,
you didn't have,
yeah,
like you
yeah.
said,
But
everybody in your life was in the cult. You didn't have other people you could just call.
No, I didn't. I had no one, all my friends, except for this one friend from the Bible study that I'm telling you about. And God bless her. I mean, she did help me so much. But I knew no one outside of the cult. All my closest friends were cult. Everyone in my, so it meant stepping away from everyone I'd known. And it meant I was willing to do whatever it took. I'd made the decision. So if it meant staying in a women's shelter for a week while I tried to figure out where I was going to live, I did it. And I didn't have that miraculous outside person at this point to be my accountability, as you can tell. But I had made the decision I wanted out. So I was seeking it. I was praying desperately, God, please bring safety into my life. Please bring something where I can get a break from this and heal. And next time I'll share a little bit about the amazing and miraculous answers that God gave to that prayer, because he does hear when we're desperate and we're willing to give everything up, he does hear. And I know that some people say, well, I can't do that. I've got kids. I've got this. And I understand that. I'm not judging when I say that. Now, my children had both graduated from high school and were in college. Well, one was in college. The other was in his senior year, but he was living with my first husband, my ex, who was still in the cult. And that's a whole other story too. He went back. But it's not easy to find safety. But I do believe if you give a heartfelt cry from the depths of your being for help, that God does hear it. He does answer. It may not be fast. It may not be easy. It may mean looking for creative solutions that at first you wonder about, but it is possible. And
Yes.
I believe now, looking back, that God was helping me, guiding me, protecting me, nudging me along at times, and helping me in spite of how difficult that time. I couldn't have survived that time of my life without his help. I was praying at the time, and he was encouraging me all along.
And you see why it's such a miracle that A, that you were able to get out, and B, that you're here speaking. I always say that listening to any survivor speak is a miracle because they do everything to make sure that you stay. They invest years and money and time into you to make sure that you don't remember, don't speak out, and that there's consequences if you do. If you do try to leave, they send handlers and honeypots and people to be implanted in your life to bring you back or reaccess you. They take your refunds away, or excuse me, your resources away. They take your funds away. It's really horrific, the measures that they're willing to go to keep people in these systems. And again, that's why your work is so important, Svali, because you're helping people literally just the title of your book, Breaking Free of Cult Programming, like you're helping people understand not only what's going on, but how to get free. And your own testimony is a testament to this being possible. And I really appreciate your courage to share because I know this stuff is really painful and really difficult to talk about. And again, I would love to ask everybody listening to please, 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 please pray over Svali, reach out, support her, pray over everything that she's doing because this is, not only is it tough to leave, but there's a lot of spiritual warfare. We're talking about a lot of the physical aspects of captivity, but there's also the spiritual aspects. So even if she's not being physically attacked, there's a lot of spiritual warfare that happens
Mhm.
with survivors that speak out. So please pray against that, everybody. Please rebuke any demons and any negative forces that come against her. Please pray that she remains protected and safe as she continues to speak out and help set the captives free.
Yes, I agree. And finally, I do want to say it's worth the struggle to get free. I don't want to leave people thinking, oh my gosh, I'd never want to go through it. It's worth it. It's worth it. I'll share more about that next time.
Okay. Before we log off for today, why don't you remind people where they can find your work and then also maybe that new book that you helped co-author. I think that's a really powerful book for people to get on their radar too.
Okay, if you go to www.wordpress.swallyspeaksagain.com. That's my blog. And under resources, if you go to the main page, on the first line of not under the links, but in the written area, you'll see a link to resources. And if you go there, you'll find a link to my book as well as some other resources that can be helpful to both survivors and therapists who want to understand more about this topic.
That is fantastic. There's a lot of resources on here too, you guys, whether you're listening or watching. All you have to do is just click. She made it super easy. And her books are on Amazon, Breaking Free from Cult Programming, and then It's Not Impossible. And then the book she co-authored, Finding Freedom, Helping Survivors of Ritual Abuse and Mind Control to Heal Back. And then on that page, if you go right below that book, it'll bring up 2 prayer warrior books that are also really powerful that I would highly recommend to you guys that Svali also helped co-author. So that's amazing, all the work that you do. And like I said, you're so selfless, Svali. You donate and devote so much time to helping others, and I just ask that everybody come and give that back to you in prayer and in love, and pray over you and help continue your journey of staying free and being safe while you do it. So I really appreciate you coming on and talking about this today.
Mhm. Well, thank you for having me, Emma. I appreciate it too.
Absolutely. And we'll schedule a part 2. I'll have all Svali's other interviews in the show notes, you guys. I'll have her blog. Please go check that out. Tons of information on there. Aside from the resource page, her blog is fantastic. Go check out the resources, support her work. There's a lot of great information in her books, whether you're a survivor, a therapist, or somebody like me who just wants to learn a little bit more about what you never learned before. So I'll have all that below, you guys. I will have my notes, or excuse me, my links in the show notes also. Connect with me on different platforms. I never know where I'm going to be or who's going to keep me up. So try to keep up with me on other platforms too. If you're only on, YouTube or Spotify or something, go on, support me on other platforms too, just so that way we can keep in touch. I appreciate you guys so much. We couldn't do this without you. I'm so grateful for all your support for every guest. Again, pray over Svali. Thank you guys so much. God bless you, and we will see you next time.